What makes an amazing story for English learners? That was one of the questions that I just asked Ariel Goodbody from Easy Stories in English. Now, you may already know Ariel and Ariel's podcast, Easy Stories in English. But in this interview, I got a look behind the curtain of how Ariel makes the show, how Ariel makes Easy Stories in English. We talked about the creative writing process, how the sausage is made, and ultimately what makes a great story. So enjoy my interview with the one and only Ariel Goodbody from Easy Stories in English. Hello, Ariel.
Hi,
Hi, how are you doing today?
I'm really good. I'm in a very bouncy mood. It's sunny. Wait, as I say that, the sun has gone behind a cloud. But yeah, I'm doing well. How are you?
I am fantastic. Not sunny, not so bouncy, but other than that, life is good. So I have Ariel Goodbody from Easy Stories in English. Ariel, it's an absolute honor for me to have you on the show today. And the focus of
Well,
our
thank you.
conversation is going to be on storytelling and storytelling tips, especially stories for English learners. As you are the host, producer, writer, you are the everything of what I think must be the most popular podcast for people learning English with stories in the world. Is that correct?
I think so. When I started, I thought surely other people must be doing the same thing, and I looked it up and I couldn't find any other ones. So to my knowledge, yes.
Well, excellent. That makes me even more honored for you to be having this conversation with me today. Ariel, for people who don't know your story, how did you get into telling stories for non-native English speakers? Can you talk me through your journey?
Do you want the abridged version or the really long version?
The very, very, very long version, please. Maybe we
Okay.
can start with the abridged version. There might be a sentence, and then we can have the very long version.
hmm So yeah, so the short version is in 2019, I had just started teaching English and I like writing, so I decided to combine the two and make a podcast with graded stories for learners. But the kind of longer story is I've always liked writing. I did quite a bit of writing as a teenager, but it was always kind of vaguely like, oh, maybe one day I'll become a novelist, right? As I think a lot of people do. And then in my last year of university in 2016, I had a mental breakdown. Uh, and I was like really stressing about what I was going to do after university because I just felt like I couldn't handle like a traditional job. So I thought, well, maybe I'll focus on the writing. And at the time, self publishing or independent publishing, as in publishing your own work through Amazon and not going through a traditional publisher, that was becoming more popular and more viable as a career path, especially in certain genres. There are lots of self published authors of romance novels, crime, thriller. So I decided to write romance novels. So I wrote, I tried really hard to hit the market, right? Because the market with this online self published stuff was very fast. So there were romance authors writing like one novel every month, um, or a novella, like a short novel. So I tried doing that. And specifically, I was writing what's the term, shifter romance, which is like a subgenre of romance where like they can like transform into like werewolves or dragons or
Oh,
whatever. So
okay.
it's very popular based on Twilight. This is not the answer you expected, I'm sure. So anyway, I did that for a while. I published about 6 or 7 novellas, and then I burned out because it was just ridiculous trying to meet that publishing pace. And I, yeah, I when I came to the podcast a few years later, I was very wary because I had had that experience burning out from pushing myself to write so much before. So I think I approached it very differently. In a way, it was quite a relief to have the learning aspect because it gave me something to focus on, and I was like, as long as it meets these criteria, I can be proud of this work, right? And of course, doing shorter fiction is quite freeing in a way because you can just focus on one idea for a short time and then move on. So that's kind of how I got into it from like a broader creative aspect. Um, and I don't know if I've actually ever told that story before. I certainly haven't. I don't think I've told it to most of my listeners. So it's just some slightly weird background knowledge. Yeah.
Wow. Shifter fiction is something. I mean, I was aware of the existence of that kind of genre, but I didn't realize it was called shifter, and I didn't realize it was quite so big. Why why were people flooding the market so much? Is it because you just kind of have to hope that one finally sticks, or you have readers who just so keen for more? Why? What is the rationale with publishing so many so frequently?
Right. So another name for that genre, that actually probably the more common name, is paranormal romance. I just remembered. But anyway, so in I think around like I can't remember when Kindle started, but when the Kindle was first released, it did create a huge shift in publishing because before then, everyone was like, ebooks are just not going to be a big thing. Like, who wants to read a digital book, right? And then the Kindle came along, and at the beginning, it was a gold rush. If you published any book on Amazon, even with a really cheap cover, people were making book covers in Microsoft Word. They were
Mm.
literally like putting text on pictures in Microsoft Word, and they were selling books because there was so little competition. There were so few people publishing ebooks that if you already had a book or you just wrote one quickly, you could sell. So the first kind of, I guess, pioneers of ebooks, they quickly built an audience. And I suppose the reason it became a very quick market is because well, first of all, it's a big advantage compared to traditional publishing because traditional publishing is incredibly slow. You know, it can take several years for a book to go through the whole process. So by being fast, um, these writers could kind of find a trend or a niche and then give the readers what they wanted. It's also worth noting that with romance, for example, the readers are incredibly voracious. Voracious as in they just want lots of it. Romance readers, a lot of them will read one book every day or two. Um, and so for a lot of them, if they're just relying on the traditional market, they don't have enough books. Like if they like an author, they're like, I want more of this right now. So it's kind of always been, you know, there are these traditional romance publishers like Mills and Boon who produced a lot of books, but even compared to that, the new market is very, very fast. And I definitely think the quality suffers in a lot of ways, but it's kind of like, I guess, the difference between watching a soap opera or a TV show versus films, right?
Mm.
Like sometimes people just want that more kind of like popcorn content. Yeah.
Okay, I see. And so, for anyone watching this or listening to this and thinking, I didn't realize Easy Stories in English was about shape shifting romance stories, you've moved in a
It's
different
not.
direction.
Yeah, this is the thing. It's like my podcast, when I started, I used fairy tales and folk tales mainly because it's very universal, it's very accessible for people of different language backgrounds. Um, and I never really thought of it as targeting a particular age demographic, but obviously a lot of young people, well, a lot of people listen with their kids or they tell the stories to their kids because they appeal to children as well. So I've been very conscious of I have much more of a family friendly, I guess, vibe or persona on the podcast.
Mm.
Although actually recently I have done slightly more mature stories, and I've kind of, warned people at the start that maybe this one is not for kids. But yeah, it's a very different approach for sure.
Okay, so we're back in 2016, 2017 or so, and you're
Mhm.
publishing you're publishing shape shifting. What was the other term you used for it? The uh,
Paranormal romance. Yeah.
paranormal romance fiction, and kind of riding the wave of Amazon self publishing. And then fast forward to 2019, you burned out from that, and you realized, actually, I'm going to do something a little bit more family friendly and lean on my experience as an English teacher.
Mm. Yeah. So when I did my teacher training course in late 2017, I did a lot of research on different methods for teaching English. And I discovered this theory called the theory of comprehensible input, which was developed by Stephen Krashen in the 1970s, which basically argues that we learn language through input, which is reading and listening, and input that is comprehensible. So it has to be understandable at our current level. And this is how children learn language as well, right? People talk to them, they change the way they talk to be more understandable, and there's clear contexts for the communication, right? Like, do you want milk? They're holding a bottle of milk. They'll maybe say, "Oh, do you want milk?" Like, they change the tone, they simplify the language, and so on. And basically, if you take comprehensible inputs as a base for teaching a second language, then it makes sense to focus on communication, right? Rather than focusing on grammar or exercises or like role plays, you're really focusing on what are we communicating? What is the context of our class? So, conversation classes is like a very typical way of doing that, right? You're building a relationship, a friendship, and that's the context in which you're using the language. But also, storytelling is a wonderful communicative context for teaching because stories are universal, they're interesting, and they connect with our imagination as well. So I became really interested in teaching methods that use storytelling. There's a teaching method called TPRS, teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling, where essentially language teachers create stories with their students collaboratively. And that formed the foundation for my teaching, but then also the podcast. So, really, it was a way of taking the teaching I was already doing and seeing how I could translate that to like a podcast context. Because I had wanted to make a podcast for a while. When I was a teenager, I did a lot of YouTube, like video blogging. I've always kind of been one of those nerds in their bedroom making things. So it was kind of a combination of all of those threads. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess nerd in their bedroom making things is a very easy transition to making podcasts.
Yeah. And it's much easier than video because video takes a long time, as I'm sure you know.
It certainly
Yeah.
is. Um, so, okay, let me ask you this question then, and let's, I think, move the focus more onto stories for it's just family-friendly stories rather than romance fiction. But maybe you can answer this question more generally. What, in your opinion, makes a great story?
Oh my God, that's probably the hardest question I'm going to get during this whole interview because I used to be really into the hero's journey. So, the hero's journey is this structure for stories. And actually, people often don't know that the hero's journey goes back to a book, an academic book called the the Hero with a Thousand Faces. So there's this academic, Joseph Campbell, who went and analyzed myths from cultures around the world and tried to create the monomyth, the kind of structure that transcends all of these myths, that's universal. And that's the basis of the hero's journey. And as you know, Hollywood is absolutely in love with the hero's journey. If you look at blockbuster films, Star Wars, they all just follow the hero's journey exactly, right? And I used to be very attached to that for what I considered good writing. It's a very familiar structure when you're a writer. So I guess the idea is if you follow the structure well and maybe have some good surprises that move away from it a bit, then that's a good story.
So can I just
But my thoughts have.
stop
Mhm.
you and ask one question? I imagine many people here will know what the hero's journey is. And I'm sure when you talk about it, they'll recognize it in almost everything they see. But can you just walk me through what happens in the typical hero's journey, what the structure is?
Okay, there are 12 stages, kind of like the wheel of a clock. And this is the thing, like the original, it all ties back to myth, right? Because the wheel is like it's a cyclical idea of time, which is very different to like the linear time that we think of nowadays. So I'll try and remember roughly. The hero is called to journey. Well, okay, at first we get kind of like an introduction to the hero. What is their life? What is their context? Then they get called to the journey. Like, you need to go and save the princess. And at first, the hero rejects the call, and then eventually they have to accept the call. Then they go on the journey, and they face steadily increasing trials. So they have difficult things that get harder. Around the midpoint of the story, they die symbolically. So this might be they get really, really depressed, like in a romance story, or it might be that, for example, in Star Wars, like there's a scene where I think Luke gets uh is being attacked by like a monster and he's drowning and you think like, oh my god, he's going to die, right? It's like the symbolic death. Or in the story of Christianity, that Christ is crucified, he literally dies, but then the next kind of notch is the next part of the story is they are revived, right? So they go through this horrible experience that is like death, and then they come out alive again. And then they face trials again, like they did before, but this time they beat the trials. They're getting stronger and stronger. They defeat the last boss, the final enemy. They collect, I think it's referred to as the potion or the magic object, basically. They collect their reward and then they go home and they're back in the original context, but now they've changed. And we see how their change affects their relationship to the life that they knew before. That's the hero's journey. Now, the hero's journey um, is the kind of core messages. The hero gets stronger by being alone. So they start in a place of community, and then gradually they get lonelier and lonelier, and they have to face the great trial by themselves with their own strength. And then they are brought back to community. But actually, there's another structure that's also very common that people often don't know about, which is the heroine's journey. Now, hero and heroine is like male and female, but that doesn't necessarily mean that hero's journey is always male characters and heroine's journey is always female characters. Like, you can argue that there are female characters who have heroes journeys and male characters who have heroines journeys. So in the heroine's journey, it's again like a similar structure, but the general idea is that the hero starts off alone and then they get stronger through community. So they get stronger through teaming up with people and kind of focusing more on that emotional strength. um so that's one example of how like the hero's journey can be a bit limiting because it forces us to like think in this very individualist mindset. So yeah.
And when you first started writing the stories for Easy Stories in English, were you following that kind of structure, or did you almost reject that from the outset?
Well, that's the thing, is before the podcast, I would have said like, oh yeah, you want to follow the hero's journey. And then I started adapting fairy tales and myths. And fairy tales, often they follow a similar structure, but they tend to have their own kind of structural elements that repeat. And fairy tales are weird, right? Like there are very strange things that keep appearing in fairy tales. There are classification systems that some academics use where they say like this is a type 74 fairy tale because they find stories around the world that all fit this structure, and they can be incredibly specific, like stories about a girl who has 7 brothers and all of the brothers are transformed into an animal and then she eventually puts them back into humans. There are loads of stories with that very specific structure. Or like Cinderella, there are Cinderella stories all around the world, and
Mm,
it's almost always a shoe of some kind. So that kind of got me more interested in this broader mythological concept of storytelling where it's less about a specific structure and it's more about these kind of universal human elements that we feel on like a subconscious level and that you can kind of pick and choose from. So like a very common structure in fairy tales is having a thing happens 3 times, right?
mhm,
And I think often these structures are practical because they came from oral cultures where they didn't have writing, so they had to be easy to memorize. But in a way, that kind of fits very well, I think, with teaching because it's creating structures that feel kind of natural, I guess,
mm.
in a sense. I don't, I still feel like I've not really answered your question because now I I think when I first started writing, I really tried to approach it top down, where I was like, let me figure out the structure and plan it and then write the story. But now I very much let the story kind of build uh, bottom up, and the structure kind of comes naturally. I don't think about it too much, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk more about them, about your creative writing process, and maybe we can talk also about how that has evolved because I think you've done I think it was 210 different episodes when I checked this morning of Easy Stories in English. Perhaps there are more, but a lot. Let's say, a lot of stories. It's a serious body of work, and perhaps we could also talk about how your creative writing technique has evolved over that period because
Mm.
I imagine like anyone going on a journey you have changed, got better perhaps, although I know you're even from the start they were excellent. So how how do you now go about writing a story? You say it kind of bubbles up from inside, but can you talk me through as much as you can do the process of doing that and how long it takes? Sort of, do you kind of sit down and think, right, I'm going to do this today. That's going to be done, or do you always have, you know, 5 or 10 different ideas bubbling along, and you're going on a walk and thinking, "Ah, actually, that's that's the direction this one should take, or like, ha, what is your special sauce?
um, so I always find that phrase "special sauce" really funny because that just makes me think of like actually I just pour on some sriracha and then it really gets the story going. So I
That's a very
tend
special sauce.
I think it tends to be 2 kinds for me. There's the kind of story where I'm like, okay, I just need to get a story out there. And what I'll often do is there's this website run by a professor at the University of Pittsburgh. It's like a collection of fairy tales and folk tales from different cultures, but they're grouped. So, for example, you'll have Little Red Riding Hood stories, but there'll be 10 different versions from 10 different cultures that all are slightly different, right? And I might just read through all of them and then kind of create my own version that synthesizes them. And that's quite often how I'll adapt stories for the podcast. So there's a lot of ones where it's in this ambiguous area where, I wrote the story myself and I certainly add elements and remove elements and change things, but it's based on, a pre-existing myth or fairy tale. And that, I can do that pretty quickly now. I would say I've kind of got the muscle memory. So it varies depending on how challenging the source material is. But generally, I go through like a period sometimes, like at Christmas, just before Christmas, I just like bashed out like 5 stories in like a few days. So that's one kind, and that comes in like waves where I'll just be like, I'm just going to do this, which is really fun creatively to just kind of like get some stuff out. And then there's the other kind, which is a bit more usually when I'm completely starting from scratch, where I'll usually have a concept at the beginning that I don't know the ending. I just have this idea of like where to start the story, or the kind of the structure. Like, oh, what if I took, for example, I had this story I did called The Perfect Pet, where it was someone who really wanted pets and he couldn't when he was growing up because his parents didn't let him. But then he became an adult and he's like, okay, I'm going to get a dog. But then he's allergic to the dog. And then the cat is really mean. And then, so it's like a comedy of just, it keeps going wrong, right?
Mm.
I knew that's what I knew. So I was like, okay, I can write the story based on that and then see what happens. But then sometimes the ending is like a complete twist, a completely unexpected thing. With that story, The Perfect Pet, it ends very darkly. Kind of
Oh.
ends with Sweeney Todd. He starts up a butcher where he secretly kills bad pets and sells their meat. So
Oh.
when I wrote that story, I was like, whoa, I did not see that coming. So sometimes that I think there's often like an unknown element which really helps, but sometimes you hit a problem like the story is not going how I thought it would, or something is missing, and that can be so frustrating because sometimes it's a case of I leave the story, I come back a day later or a few days later, and I'm like, oh, obviously, and then I just finish it. But sometimes um, like I had actually I think the last episode of the podcast they did when we're at the time of recording is called What Makes a Snake? And it's a very long story. And I wrote that like, God, I think I almost a year ago originally. And then I sent it to a friend who I workshop a lot of things with because he's also a writer, and he gave me some advice, and then I like changed a bit, and then I came back a few months later and I like did the kind of final version. But even then, like there are times when I'm recording a story and I'm like, oh, this isn't very good. Like I probably should have changed this. But at a certain point, you just have to stop
Mm.
and say this is as good as it will get, right? Like there's a something I heard someone say about poetry, which was you never finish a poem, you just abandon it, right? Like there's never going to be like the perfect finish for a lot of things. So yeah, sometimes I really like grapple and struggle with the story. I'd actually say right now I'm in a bit of a creative slump. Like I think I've been doing lots of performance recently, which has been amazing. But then when it comes to writing, I'm finding it very hard, partly because I don't have so much time. And then also it's like, I, yeah, I haven't been reading so much fiction recently. I've been reading like more philosophy and stuff. So I'm hoping, hopefully this interview will give me some ideas.
It's certainly given me lots of ideas. Yeah. So it's really interesting, going back to the perfect pet example. So you kind of have this idea of, right, there's this character who's this boy who was never allowed a pet when he's growing up. Do you sort of start with that, or think I want to have a scenario where someone gets into all sorts of has kind of disappointing but funny funny experiences, and therefore I need to create a reason for that to happen. And the reason for that to happen is that he wanted pets. Oh, the reason for that to happen is animals. And why is he having all these animals? Because he wasn't allowed pets as a child. Or do you kind of start with the character, if you see what I mean?
Mm. So that's an interesting question. I think because I'm writing short stories, I don't usually have the luxury of having like a really deep character, right? Like in short fiction, you have to condense things so much that the characters tend to be very archetypical. Like this is the stupid but well-intentioned hero, or this is
Mm,
the person who's like a tragic figure or whatever. So actually, um, I don't normally think of it in this way, but I think if I was to take that concept again of the boy who wants a pet but can't have it, you could kind of filter that through a number of very broad genres. So I went for comedy, right, where it's comedic that it keeps failing, but then it switches into tragedy, right,
mm,
where it becomes really dark. um and I didn't think about this before, but I guess that's why it was such a in my opinion, it's one of my best stories, and it's actually one of the most listened stories. And I think it's that switch from comedy to tragedy which like is really shocking. But you could also, let's say it was a romance story, it would be about, you could have it be romance in the sense of like not literally romantically being involved with an animal, because no, that's bad. But you could take the structure of a romance story and apply that to finding the right, the pet who you feel like is your best friend for life, right?
mm,
Or it could be about uh, he's looking for a pet, but then he meets a beautiful, beautiful woman, and they fall in love, and that kind of becomes the story. So that could be romance. It could be okay. So we have comedy, tragedy, romance. What are the other ones? Uh, Action. It could be like, oh, he has to like break into this facility to rescue this dog because he's like, this dog needs me. You could essentially take that in a lot of directions. And I guess often when I'm writing, um, I've kind of subconsciously decided already, is it going to be like a happy or a sad story? And then a lot of the decisions kind of just flow out naturally from that. There is also, though, this kind of back and forth where sometimes the language, that the constraints of the language change how I write the story. So if I'm doing particularly like a beginner level story, if I introduce a new word that's like a higher level, I want to repeat it a few times. So quite often I do this fairy tale thing of the repetition of three, right? Like, oh, he meets three different people, or he tries three different pets, right? And it's
mm,
basically just a way of repeating the vocabulary and making the context really clear so it's accessible for learners. So I feel like it's kind of, they feed into each other very nicely. Yeah.
mm. Okay, yeah, I see. I, I know we're gonna later on. We're gonna talk more about the, actually writing for a an English learning audience. There's one thing you said just a few minutes ago that I thought is interesting, and I mean, there's many things that are interesting, but a particular thing was that with shorter stories, you have to you kind of have to let the characters be a little bit more stereotypical, and you don't can't really develop them so much. And the reason I thought this was interesting was because I've been writing a few stories, and I've been working with a guy called Emil. He's been writing some amazing stories for some courses we've made, and uh, one of the things that we've been struggling with is the fact that I guess as a writer, as someone who's creating the stories, you sort of have in your mind what this person, what the characters want, who they are, why they might take certain decisions, but you can't really explain all of that in in a story, in a short story at least. And so it's been a real challenge to get the balance right between sort of saying like, this is Janet, and this is who she is. She feels this way because of these experiences that she had in the past, and blah blah.
Mm.
Um, and you have to have that mixture of explaining someone's character through their actions, but at the same time,
Yeah.
uh, making that character both believable in terms of they are doing things that the audience thinks are rational, but at the same time allowing them to surprise the listener. Like it sounds like in The Perfect Pet, I imagine people were not expecting the main character to start chopping up his animals and selling them. That sounds like a out of character decision, but I can completely understand why that story was so successful because it kind of takes an interesting twist. Whereas if that character, had just settled down with a nice cat or had met a nice person on a park bench and fallen in love with them, okay, nice ending, but it's probably not going to make you remember the story so much. So I can completely understand why that um, that type of unpredictability was so successful. Um, Again, it might sound like an easy question or a simple question, but do you find writing shorter or longer stories more difficult?
I first of all just want to say about that particular story, I did get a comment from a listener who was like, I know you warned us that this story is really difficult for animal lovers, but I told my 16-year-old daughter the story and she cried. And I was like, okay, but I did warn you, so you
Yeah.
chose to tell her. But yeah,
Plus,
um,
if you told her, you knew what was happening, so you should have you should have
yeah.
perhaps known
And
your
also,
daughter's
like, I'm
reaction better.
sorry, being a writer, when someone tells you that your story made them cry, it's just like, oh, it's like a compliment, right? And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry I made your daughter cry, but also, like, I did that. Uh, so, to answer your question, I generally think longer stories are harder to write. And I think that's because stories tend to grow exponentially. So if I have like a really simple short story, I can reduce a lot of details and that's fine. But as soon as it gets longer, you start introducing more details and then it's kind of like a weed. That's maybe not the nicest metaphor, but it is in a way. It's like a weed that spreads out, and like if you start trying to chop off certain parts, it gets out of control, right? And that's one of the lovely challenges, I guess, about writing short fiction, but not super short fiction. But I think, I don't know if you've ever like read a novel where you felt like this could have been 200 pages shorter, right? Where it just feels like,
There's definitely parts
this
of
is, why is this so
War and
long?
Peace where I thought, maybe this bit wasn't quite so necessary. But
Yeah. And then sometimes I've read things where I felt actually this needed to be longer because they're going through it so fast, right? So I think stories, they're kind of living creatures in a way where they have an ideal length where they sit the most comfortably. And that, yeah, I guess for me that means that I know there are people who are the opposite. Some people find it harder to go short, but I think I've done it enough that it's kind of like a comfortable place for me now. Yeah.
mm. And yeah, I completely agree that there are some even like very long books where you think this is all completely necessary and it didn't feel long at all. Like when I was a teenager, I absolutely loved The Count of Monte Cristo. I must have read it like two or three times, even though
Wow. Okay.
uh, you know it has an ending which which you remember. So it's not a kind of it's not necessarily the kind of book that you'd read multiple times, but it's so full of like it's a kind of fast paced action book. And I remember completely loving it. And similarly, there are a few, I don't know, business related books that I had the misfortune of reading that might only be 100 pages. And you think like, God,
And it could have been a blog post.
this was a paragraph, really, the main point here. Um,
Yeah.
anyway, let's move on a bit and talk more about some of the constraints that you maybe a constraint is the right word, I guess, but the constraint
Mm.
you have when writing fiction creating fictional stories for non-native English speakers. And let me just add one thing: is that Ariel has a wonderful website where you can go and look at the stories and look at them on by level. And well, I looked this morning. It seems like most of your stories are between beginner there's 71, pre-intermediate there's 66, intermediate there's 46, and there's 16 advanced ones. So it seems like you're mainly focused on the kind of beginner to pre-intermediate type level.
Yeah.
Yeah, how do you think about creating stories for non-native English speakers, and how do you go about how do you go about that process?
Yeah, so with the level thing, like the division of the levels, I don't know if it's something I consciously thought about at the beginning, but certainly now I'm very conscious of I'm not trying to make my listeners dependent on my stories for life, right? And I think there are some online English teachers who they they build this brand where they kind of the idea is that you just follow them forever. And the thing is, if you're learning a language, you sort of have this identity of like, I'm an English learner. But at a certain point, when you get to a high level of English, I think it's useful to kind of discard that identity a bit and focus on like, I am just a speaker of English, right? Because then you're equality with other speakers. And I know this is a very weird way to approach the question, but I guess like with the advanced level stories, I don't do them very often because I'm kind of like, look, if you're at this level, go read a novel, go watch a TV show, go watch a film, right? Obviously, my one is a bit more aimed at learners, like it's not native speaker level, but the difference is not that far, right? That once you get to that level of English, it gets a lot easier to access those harder materials. So I focus on the beginner and the pre-intermediate levels, which the way I use them is kind of equivalent to A2 and B1 in the European frame of reference for language levels. I focus on them because I find from my own experience learning languages that that is where there is the biggest gap in good materials, interesting materials. Ideally, I would also do like complete beginner, like A1, but it's very hard to do that without translation or visual aids. So
Mm,
that's kind of practically why I started a bit higher.
of course. Okay, so when you're thinking about a story, are you thinking that the the nature of this story, the level of complications and so on, naturally lends itself to a beginner story or an intermediate story or so on? And are you do you have that learner in mind as you're writing it, or are you kind of writing it thinking I'm going to go a little bit simpler or a little bit more complicated, and afterwards then I'm going to decide what level it should be?
Yeah, so now I very much choose the level before I write, or I start writing and I'm like, oh, this is going to fit that. And one of the tools I have for doing that is I use a resource called English Vocabulary Profile, which is made by the University of Cambridge. They basically take data from their English language exams to figure out which words are which level. So they really divide like these are A1 words, A2 words, B1 words, B2 words, and so on. It's an amazing resource. We're very lucky to have it because it doesn't really exist for other languages, to my knowledge. So I can just type in words and see how difficult they are, right? And that's really useful because if I have an idea for a story and I'm like, oh, I want to write it at this level, but actually I'm not sure, it might be too difficult. I'll write a list of the absolutely essential words, like these are the words I must have to tell the story, and I'll check the levels basically, and then kind of
Okay.
do it based on that. In the past, I've had a few times where I wrote a story and realized this is too hard. I need to move it up a level. Or conversely, I was like, actually, I can probably put this down a level and just remove a few words. But that's really tedious. It feels like it kind of is not very fun creatively. There have also been times where I've written a story without thinking of levels and just done it as like a native speaker level, and then changed it and adapted it kind of separately for the podcast. But that's very difficult because when you're writing at that level of complexity, you're not thinking of a learner, and then it can be very difficult to change that. It's funny though, they are constraints, this level system, but actually I think it's been one of the best things for my creativity, like ever, because creativity really thrives in under constraints. And like there's an episode I wrote called The Labyrinth, which is a pre-intermediate level, like B1. And I wrote it and I realized I was like, actually, I could probably submit this to like a literary magazine. I don't know if it would get accepted, but actually, even though it was written for learners, I tried to do it in a poetic way that actually made it still interesting to native speakers. And I think that is, it's been really transformative for my creativity, for sure.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm just trying to keep track of the episodes that we should tell people to definitely listen to. The Labyrinth, the Perfect Pet, something snake. Was there a something snake in there?
Oh, what makes a snake? Yeah,
What makes
it's
a
a long
snake?
one, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe at the end I can ask you for your top recommendations about where people should start. Okay. Cool. And I had another question. Actually, it's a sort of, it's not necessarily related to you specifically, but something that has changed in the world of writing recently. And I guess that is AI. And lots of,
Mm.
I know there are tools now where you can tools that are built off the OpenAI APIs, where you can input like a list of characters and some themes and a location and so on, and then ta-da, after 10 seconds you have a full blown story. And I wanted to ask your thoughts on these tools and whether you see this as any kind of threat, or it actually just is going to be helpful to someone like you who is a talented creative writer, because it separates people like you from the more generic stuff that might be created by these AIs. So yeah, over to you. What are your thoughts on AI and the creative writing industry?
Yeah, I've been thinking about it a lot recently because there are kind of two anecdotes I have, which is one, so I have kind of on and off been learning Slovak, and Slovak is a language that has very few resources. And my friend who is also learning Slovak sent me this website, which is kind of similar to mine. The idea is it's short stories for learning languages, but they have like dozens of languages. They have Afrikaans, they have Slovak, they have Korean, and they do like one story every day. It's crazy. So I was like, okay, something strange is happening here. And I went and listened to one of the stories for Slovak. And I am very good at identifying an AI voice because, I have reasons to do so. But if someone didn't know the voice was AI, they might not realize, right? Because AI voices are actually pretty good now. They just sound like a very competent, but maybe slightly boring podcaster, let's say. And like maybe occasionally they stress the wrong word, right? But the story itself was like, my cabbage adventure. I went and visited this shop in my local town, and then I slipped over and I fell and I hit a cabbage, and there was cabbage leaves everywhere, and we all laughed about it. And the story made sense, but it did feel a bit like a story that was written by an alien who didn't quite understand how like human relationships work. And I had such mixed feelings about it because if someone can use this to learn a language, then surely it's good on some level, right? But then there's something inside me that really feels uncomfortable with this idea of they're learning from this kind of like soup, this kind of content soup that's made up by AI that's just mashing together all of these different ideas. And of course, culturally, I feel like AI can't teach you about, well, I don't know. With my podcast, I don't focus on teaching British culture or anything like that, but I imagine that it comes through in my writing
Of course.
and that generally, you know, students are learning culture in like a kind of a natural context. Whereas with this I have no idea. I imagine that wouldn't be the case. So that's weird. And I want to clarify, like, whether I think it's ethically wrong for that person to be doing it that way, I don't really know. I have mixed feelings about it. But the other case with AI that's happened recently is people have been plagiarizing me. They'll take my transcript, they'll get an AI voice to read it out, and then they'll put it on YouTube with like text. And I've already had to send down some copyright claims to get them removed. But I did that with one person who had two channels and he removed those videos. But then there was another channel with almost exactly the same name, with almost exactly the same videos, who plagiarized the same stories of mine, who apparently is a different person because that person is plagiarizing the style. That person is plagiarizing the style of the other plagiarist.
Wow.
Because I
Okay.
was emailing this first guy and he said, "Oh no, that's me. That's not me. They're copying me." And I was like, I
Mm.
wonder how that feels to have someone copy your work. And what annoyed me was if someone took my podcast and put it on YouTube and kept everything the same, and it said Ariel Goodbody, easy stories in English, I would be annoyed, but whatever. Like, people are knowing it's me. But what these people did is they changed my name to Sam Goodbody. They put a robot voice and they changed the name of the podcast. So they were pretending it wasn't them, right? And that to me is like, it's just sad. It's just
Mm.
really sad. So I right now I don't have the warmest, most positive feelings about AI, to be honest.
What did they say? Imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. Is that a phrase, something like that? That seems strange because I mean, I guess they were hoping for lots of money from YouTube, but
Yeah.
clearly that is, it is free to listen to your podcast, right? And do you already put them on
And,
YouTube?
well, this is the thing is I was, and then I've got a backlog of ones that I need to upload because I was using a system that stopped working, and then I got behind on the admin. So this is very much given me motivation to get to work on that and put them on YouTube. But actually, another thing I've noticed is some people, they'll take a story and then they'll use AI to change it so it doesn't seem like plagiarism. But
Mm.
the AI just changes the words to synonyms. And so it sounds ridiculous because
Yeah,
it's like, oh, this is a story of a young male who lived in an impoverished life in a petite village, and it's not like it's using the words in the wrong way, right? And that I think is harmful because you're saying this is for learners, but it's this completely artificial language.
yeah. I get it's even worse, I imagine, than the kind of videos that where people are told, don't say "I'm fine, thanks," saying like "I'm all right if you care to ask me," or whatever these other very strange things that people think native English speakers say, rather than just admit that actually most people say "I'm fine," or people do use the word "good." You don't always have to say fantastic or brilliant or wonderful. You can good is it's
Yeah,
a very good word to say. People say it a lot. In fact, it's probably the best
yeah.
word for saying good. Um, so yeah, I guess those kind of things don't make for catchy YouTube videos, but there we go. Okay, cool. So I know I've taken up a lot of your time, Ariel. Um, my last question really is, if someone is listening to this and they are thinking, "Wow, easy stories in English sounds fantastic," or sounds good, which of course I hope they would be. Where is the what is the best way for them to get started? What episode should they be listening to? And how can people get involved?
So go to easystoriesinenglish.com. On the website, you can find all of the transcripts for all of the stories. So you can read and listen at the same time. It's available on all the podcast apps: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. I was going to say wherever you are, but unfortunately, because of wars and sanctions, that isn't always the case. So you may need to use a VPN, for example, if you're in Russia. Um, the stories to start with, I would say, is The Perfect Pet. Um, and actually, another story to do with snakes is called Misty the Snake. That's a beginner level story. I think those are two very funny, slightly dark stories. Um, if you're looking for something maybe a bit more advanced, um, The Labyrinth is a great episode. That's a pre-intermediate episode. Um, yeah, to be honest, I would say just try one of the recent episodes and see if you like it. Some people go back and listen from the start, but the early episodes, I wasn't amazing at leveling them. I think they were a bit too difficult. And also, if you listen to the really early episodes, I'm like, hello, my name is Ariel Goodbody. I don't have a very good performance style yet. So I would say start with the recent episodes. Yeah.
Start with the
And
most recent
basically
ones.
try a level. If it's too easy, try the one above. If it's too hard, try the one below.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing so much about your creative process and the journey of Easy Stories in English. You make a fantastic show, and everyone should go and check it out immediately.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And yes, as you can tell, I love talking about stories. So I'm very happy to have had this conversation. And yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Ariel. Bye.
Bye.